You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. And now for a brand new show we hope you'll like. Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Supplemental. Have more hot takes. Will still travel. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
I'm Ashley Thomas.
And I'm Norman Lau, representing the Roddenberry industrial complex, which will not be denied.
Has anyone actually tried to deny it? I mean, just see what happens?
It's foolish. It is foolish and ill-advised.
Each week on Gene-ology, we set our guns on Gene Roddenberry's early TV writing, aiming for hints of the morals, meanings, and messages that would eventually travel into Gene's most famous later work, Star Trek.
But that's not what we're doing today. And thank you to Earl and to Ashley for inviting me back to discuss more of my hot takes with y'all. I feel like I got to get a little bit more southern here, y'all. About Have Gun Will Travel and some of the other episodes that you've covered so far on Gene-ology. I think we're going to be doing another 4 to 5 episodes here. And yeah, I'm not sure, like, what is the definition of a hot take? Is it just an opinion or is it a contrary opinion?
I don't think it has to be a contrary opinion. I think it's just whatever you came up with in the moment. You know, it doesn't have to be controversial, but it can be unfiltered.
Okay, I can do that. All right.
As in hot off the grill, hot off the presses.
Well, I like that. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right.
That works. We can make it work. Before we get to this week's show, let me take a brief moment to encourage all of you listening, if you haven't already, to join our Patreon or follow us on YouTube or leave a review wherever you're listening to us. Those 5-star and written reviews are the best way to help other folks find the show, and we really appreciate you doing that. And also, if you join the Patreon, you get access to the Discord. We are doing cool stuff. We have finally started doing Gene-ology After Dark on the regular Wednesday nights in the Discord, and it's been a lot of fun so far getting other eyes on these shows and kind of seeing what everyone else thought.
Definitely been a good time.
Yeah. All right, Norman, are you packing heat for us today? Let's have the freshly heated hot takes here.
Okay, so each one of these episodes responds to a 1-ounce trigger pull. It's built to my specifications, so insert that theme music here, if you will. Or if we can't, then because licenses. So we're going to be talking about 4 or 5 episodes, I think, starting with the return of Roy Carter. Now, this episode, as far as I know, and as far as we've covered, or you all have covered, it's the first time that I've seen a continuation or kind of like a follow-up to a previous character and a previous episode, and that was the hanging of Roy Carter, which I do believe both you, Earl and Ashley, were very favorable towards from the morals, meanings, and messages because of one specific character, or maybe kind of like the conclusion of the episode. But yeah, I've rarely ever, if at all, have seen anyone return. Like, we haven't seen a Helen of Abiginian or a Maggie O'Banion, or other characters or Ella West in name, not necessarily an actress, but in name, return to an episode. So I really liked that we have the opportunity to kind of like continue that story.
I think there were a couple of other instances of characters who came back more than once, but this one, I think it's unique in that the title of the episode flags it down. Now, granted, the title is not on screen, but the title of the episode very much lets you know this is following up on something. And yet they also do a good job of summarizing everything that happened in the previous episode, just in case you missed it, because that's a big part of the story setup.
So I think the way that it'll probably be most favorable for everyone listening is I'm going to go through some of my observations and kind of like some of my morals, meanings, and messages, or maybe, favorite quotes that I found, or even some of like the smaller minutia that somehow like kind of like rubs my brain the wrong way. But anyway, so here are a couple observations. Again, we're going to have some questions maybe that are posited in these observations. But one of the first things in The Return of Roy Carter that I thought was really interesting, that Gene really emphasizes Paladin giving all due credit for the saving of Roy Carter and for ensuring his freedom from prison to Chaplain Robert April. I want to say that again, Chaplain Robert April, because that name is used in a variety of different ways throughout many of Gene's scripts, especially with the Roy Carter story here. I'm just wondering, why is this name so important to Gene? He's not just fond of using Robert April, but he emphasizes the reputation through repetition of Robert April's name. Do we have any speculation? Do we know if this is an important person to Gene's life or history?
I think it's almost got to be. What I have not been able to find out is, was there a real Robert April, and who was it? Now, as far as in the episode, I think part of the reason they are repeating his name so often is that it's a while before we see him. And I guess the feeling is we have to keep reminding the audience, oh, we are trying to find someone. We are on a quest. We are trying to find this person, and we are going to remind the audience at every turn, we are trying to find this man.
So I love that Paladin punched Roy Carter in the face. And then kind of, when he was on the ground, he threw the $1,000 fee like all over Roy, sprawled on the ground, basically making the statement of Robert April put his life and his reputation on the line for you, and the right and manly thing to do, going back to the man code, the bro code that we've discussed many times before, Earl, about how a man should, be a man of action, be the moneymaker, be the stoic, etc. This is what Roy Carter is obligated to do as a man, as opposed to, I'm just going to pay another man to do this service for me. So it's kind of like, for all intents and purposes, Paladin's bro code of the day.
I don't really read any part of the masculinity script into that. This is just like, are you a person whose word is worth anything? Are you a person of honor? That's really, I really read that as being the situation there rather than the 1870s bro code, really. It's just, what kind of person are you? Do you recognize that you owe a debt to this man, without which you might not even be here? To be getting punched in the face and, stand there while he's just making it rain.
I can see, yeah, you could definitely interpret it. This is bro code. This is something that men do. I read it as more of an integrity sort of thing. Like, this guy saved your life, and you don't have enough guts to suck it up and deal and go help him, even if it's hard or scary. You want to pay me to do it when you are certainly capable. That's not okay. I honestly, I probably would have done what Paladin did too. It was like, you need a punch in the mouth for that, because that's not okay.
And it's not just that Roy is like, oh, here, you go do it. Roy, has found a young lady who thinks he's looking particularly makey-outy tonight.
Yeah.
and, he wants to stay there in her company, and Paladin's just like, no. I mean, you wouldn't even be here to enjoy this without April having put his life on the line.
Right.
So it's time for you to return the favor. It's time to pay back the debt, in other words.
Well, I mean, I have a specific follow-up to that, because I'm glad that you brought that up. I just wanted to, for trivia's sake, because I don't know if we've covered this at all in Have Gun Will Travel, but $1,000 in 1870-ish is worth about $24,000 in 2024 dollars. That is a lot.
He's really making it rain.
Yeah, that's a lot of rainmaking right there. What you're saying there, Earl, is like, it leads into my favorite quote of the episode. And Paladin says to Roy Carter, that man he's trying to save would gladly kill him rather than go back to prison. Robert April is a man that never did one thing for me and probably never can. And right now, he's depriving me of bed, board, and comfort. There's no reason for any of this. No reason for April to be up here, and certainly no reason for you and me to be up here after him, except that I respect him more than any man I've ever met. Now, for me, that scene really took me aback because, one, I think it's one of Richard Boone's finest soliloquies written by Gene. But again, it goes back to the question, where in that particular episode, in The Hanging of Roy Carter, did he impart to Paladin that kind of reverence that Paladin to this day thinks that he is he's the most honorable man that he respects that he's ever met in all of his travels as a soldier of fortune, as a gunfighter?
I think the admiration probably comes from the fact that when everything that Paladin was doing to save Carter was not enough. The Hanging of Roy Carter, they might as well have called that one Get Carter. Because it seemed like the jail warden was definitely out to get him.
Sure.
And, when all else failed, April grabbed a hacksaw blade with his bare hands and broke it. Right. As well as a good amount of his skin.
Yeah.
And which was, interestingly, it seemed like the first time in that episode that April had literally skin in the game. That he was willing to take that kind of big swing in the name of mercy and justice. The fact that April was willing to take that kind of action without regard for his own safety or comfort. And I'm not talking about safety in terms of, oh, my hands are bleeding now. April was surrounded by a bunch of guys who easily could have turned around and shot him.
Yeah.
Because that was a very bloodthirsty scenario. Somebody was out for blood, and it was really getting to the point where, especially the jail warden, didn't seem to really care whose blood he spilled. He was going to spill somebody's blood.
Right. You're right.
Ideally Carter's, but if you got in his way of, literally executing that, then, hey, you'll do.
Yeah.
And so the fact that April was willing to play for all the marbles like that, I think, is what earned Paladin's respect. Because so often that is what Paladin is called on to do. But Paladin carries a gun. April carries a Bible. There is a power imbalance there, and so who really is taking the biggest risk? It's probably not Paladin.
Right. It's I know this is probably for those of our Discord fans that have been watching Babylon 5, this is going to be a spoiler for you, but it's one of my all-time favorite quotes, and it reminded me of exactly what you're saying, Earl. So Talon wears a sword. The bodyguard of Jakar wears a sword on his back, and Jakar is basically defenseless. And then Talon says to Jakar, he says, I carry my sword in my hand. You carry yours in your mind and your heart. That gives you a 2-to-1 favor in odds. I've always loved that. And this is very much like maybe answering my own question, because you have to ask, is Robert April's unwavering determination to always do the right thing and see the good in all situations, is this the source that Paladin has for the respect and admiration for April? Because he doesn't have that, or he doesn't have that yet. He's like, I can't get to where you are because I still have the doubt. And the gun is a symbol of the manifestation of that doubt about other human beings.
Yeah, the question kind of becomes, is going back to, and we're kind of relitigating the hanging of Roy Carter here. In that situation, would April have ever spoken up without Paladin pushing and pushing and pushing him? And in some ways demonstrating, risking his own life to save this kid that he felt was innocent. Would April have done what he did without Paladin in that story?
That's a good question. So I have kind of like a verdict here. at least for these, I think we're around 11 or 12 episodes total that were being reviewed right now. I think it's my favorite so far of all of Gene's episodes, because I think that there's this posthumous lesson that we're learning from Robert April's character, that to forgive, even in the face and these acts of evil and violence, to forgive is one step closer to finding a personal salvation, right? That forgiveness is the one thing that keeps us from being the animals that Paladin says we truly are. To quote Captain Kirk from the original series, A Taste of Armageddon, we're human beings with the blood of 1,000,000 savage years on our hands, but we can stop it. We can admit that we're killers, but we're not going to kill today. That's all it takes, knowing that we won't kill today. Put a pin in that, because I'm establishing a pattern of certain things here, I think, with this particular group of episodes. Yeah.
We're not going to kill today, but beheadings are on Wednesdays.
Right, exactly.
Beheadings are on Wednesdays.
That is a truism, and in every fandom, right? So we're going to move into the next episode, and these are kind of like in sequential order according to basically the episodic the numbers, and basically maybe the way that Gene wrote them, or I don't know, like when he delivered his scripts, but at least in terms of the production releases. So we have Episode in Laredo, a new title card opening for a Gene episode that we've seen. Paladin has a little more of an action stance, after drawing his gun. And you can see that the knight chess piece on his holster is different than the knight chess piece from the original close-up. Now, I think this is probably the difference between season 1 and season 2. Right, Earl?
Maybe a difference in shows as originally broadcast versus shows that were later edited for syndication.
Now, I love the fashion in these shows. And I forgot to mention in the Return of Roy Carter that Paladin's wearing a very sporting new leather jacket. It's very trim fit. It has mandarin toggles and a very nice sheepskin collar. But it's nowhere near as warm and as kind of like hand-sewn, stitched as this new leather jacket, which he's wearing in the rain. It's different. It has different toggles. It has actually external stitching. It has like thicker sheep skin, both collar and internal lining. So I was just wondering why he didn't wear that one in the like Arctic snow. I guess there is like when he finally makes his way to the inn. I guess when you kill somebody in self-defense, it's the innkeeper's responsibility to clean up the mess. Not only the dead body, but kind of like the detritus and the strewn about, chairs and tables and silverware as well.
Man, hospitality is a rough business.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, like when you have a bar fight, someone's got to clean it up. There's a lower decks for everybody. I mean, what did you think about that, Ashley? Like, this guy's getting kind of pushed around,
Yeah. I mean, I think this might have been the episode where we coined the term Paladin, mortal enemy of bar furniture everywhere. So, yeah, he's the guy is definitely getting bossed around by this guy who's got to be the big man in town, but I don't envy him his job. But, and then of course we get to the end of the episode and I was like, I still don't think what he did was right either. So that was a tough episode.
Yeah. I mentioned Taste of Armageddon earlier, and hey, look, so the actor who played Tuttle, he's Federation Ambassador Robert Fox from A Taste of Armageddon. I love that. I mean, it was like, it's clear as day because he has very specific eyes. There's a little bit of a bagginess underneath his eyes, and he has a very specific kind of hawkish feature. So loved seeing Gene Lyons as Tuttle in this.
And he was very good in this.
Very
Yes,
good.
he was.
Yeah, he was very good as Fox. I mean, he was believable.
He's very punchable as Fox. Here, he was also punchable. We'll get back to that, I'm sure.
So here's the thing. So I know that you're both fans. I believe you're both fans of The Princess Bride.
Oh, yeah.
Right. A lot of us in shared fandoms are fans of The Princess Bride. So why does the conversation between Paladin and Tuttle about sitting down and having a civilized conversation in the first half of this episode feel like the spiritual ancestor to Inigo Montoya's and Wesley's pre-duel conversation. It could have gone like this. I mean, in this breakfast scene, it could have gone, "You seem like a decent fellow. I hate to kill you," says Tuttle to Paladin. "You seem a decent fellow. I hate to die." Right? There's a wonderful kind of soldier of fortune's honor that's at stake here. But at the same time, ironically, it's said honor that doesn't allow Tuttle any like leverage or any kind of maneuvering room against forcing himself or being forced to the obligation of that honor. If someone's wronged me, I have to make it right, says the bro code. Again, that's the way I'm seeing some of these patterns evolve in these particular episodes of Gene's writing.
Yeah, I think this is an instance where we are seeing the basic contours of manliness in this historical time period. And we were talking off mic about, who was the first person to eat a lobster? My question is, who was the first guy to walk away and say, you know what? This fight is not worth it.
The juice is not worth the squeeze, as they say.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because Tuttle is definitely not the first guy to do that.
Right.
Because he doesn't do it at all.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, trivia aside, it's nice to see Norman Crane in there as not Ella West. She's actually acting and not yelling. So I thought that was really, really good. I think he used her as one of the artwork pieces for this episode, which was nice. I actually think I said the exact same thing to you, Earl, in a text. I love the scene between Tuttle and his quote unquote son, the young boy that comes into the bar, the saloon, because that he's a professional killer. I mean, we've established that in the very first act, but you also see that he's a man, a family man, a husband, a father, but doesn't allow that particular part of his life supersede the fact that he is a professional gunman with a reputation at stake. Again, this is going back to the code of I'm a man first, everything else second. And everything that goes along with being a man has to come first, even the possibility of my own death, because honor is at stake. My reputation is at stake. Not that my wife is openly saying, I want to find somebody else who I can grow old with and raise my son and raise a family. No. This 1 2-ounce piece of lead is literally how I'm going to stake my reputation. If I'm going to be able to kill the man in front of me, or he's going to kill me. So it was pretty, it was an interesting way of looking at the perspective of it, from Gene's writing.
I think I used the term, this is so you don't have to use the edit button or the beat button, Earl. It's a measuring contest. It's him like, I've got to be the big man in town. Nobody else can top me, blah, blah, blah.
I didn't see what Logan, the bartender, did to Tuttle, shooting him in the back. I didn't see that coming. I was actually genuinely surprised when that happened because, again, he was bullied too far. Like, Logan was always kind of like the whipping boy. He's always at the end of the beatdown, right? Clean this up, serve me this, make sure that, we're taken care of, don't allow any of the customers to come in the shop, all this kind of stuff. And you could tell that Logan's tired of it. He's tired of just being abused. And murdering Tuttle is literally like escaping his abuser. He knows what's going to happen afterwards because it wasn't in self-defense. And in the code of the law of the West, that's murder, shooting a man in the back. So, yeah, that was interesting. That's, again, going back to A Taste of Armageddon, Tuttle chose not to kill today. And he chose that's how we're going to get past this. But ironically, Logan decided to kill today because it's the only way he knows how to get past this. Right? So it was a really interesting end. I'm not exactly sure where I land on that, but this was getting into like some really deeper waters in Gene's type of style of this obfuscation, kind of like this, where do you fall, either of you, like, at the end of this episode, morally, or kind of like, where Gene's going as the possibility of being a potential Star Trek type story.
It's hard for me to let Tuttle off the hook. I don't want him dead, but I just kind of want to slap him around and tell him he needs to reprioritize because, he has a kid. He has a son to raise. And I believe in our podcast, we talked about his interest lies more with his own reputation as the big man than in seeing to that obligation. And what I believe we said was he's more interested in the blue check mark.
Yeah.
Than he is in raising his son. I can't sympathize with that. I have no chill about that. It's just like, okay, the moment, not saying I wanted the character dead, but the moment Tuttle made that clear, it's like, okay, you are dead to me, fictional character.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't necessarily want him shot in the back, but, something needed to happen to change his priorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like if he wasn't going to change or, say, you know what, I'm going to walk away from this, move on, live his life with, his family. I have no respect for somebody who would do that. And that was what he chose. That was what he chose. And, again, same with Earl. Didn't want the guy dead. I would have liked to have seen him repentant.
Yeah, I don't approve of Logan's actions, but I don't feel like it's a great loss that Tuttle is no longer in the world at the end of that story, if that's the man he's chosen to be.
I think like the gray area for me here is that it seemed that Paladin was getting to him, like the way he was getting to Robert April. Obviously not as successful. But there was in order for these characters to change, or at least have the capacity of change, there is a pause in what Tuttle was going to do. It's just that he never had a chance to completely reconcile, like with, okay, I'm going to go off to San Francisco. I'm going to be with my wife and my son. The thing is that, it all came to roost because of the abuse that he gave this other character. Right. And so it's, again, it was a different version of kind of like the Wild West law, where if you're going to take justice into your own hands, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, then, these are the repercussions of your actions, cumulatively over time. You may have killed 34 men. Some of them may have been just, some of them not, for the sake of upholding this, this premise of honor. But at the same time, though, there are all of these, like, there's an old saying, once you ascend the ladder, if you fall, be careful of the rungs that are going to hit you on the way down, right? Because there are always rungs that you step over. And Logan was one of those rungs, and he's like, you know what? This is done. I'm done with this. So, yeah, it just kind of, it left you with could Tuttle have changed or not? And I think that was a nice little signature of Gene's writing in there.
That was definitely a no easy answers episode, which really kind of surprised. And really, if you think about it, in the order that we're covering them today, kind of very similar to the return of Robert April. Because at the end of that episode, we are letting the killer get away, but we're kind of trusting that, he is going to meet with some kind of natural justice. That he is not going to survive the winter up that hill.
Right.
Is that really the best solution?
There's something very Point Break about
get an
that.
Answer there.
At the end of Point Break, Johnny Utah lets, Patrick Swayze's character go off into the great super wave that he always wanted to, whether or not that wave was going to swallow him up or if he's going to ride the wave out, he's going to let that kind of justice, speak for him. All right. So moving on to the next episode, which is a little bit of, I don't know, maybe kind of a comical break in these 5 episodes that we're doing, is going to be Is it Les Girls or Les Girls?
Les Girls is what we were saying.
Les Girls, because there is a lot of French accent type stuff going on here. All right, so this may, I guess there's this that old saying, like, if you have been around long enough, you've seen a lot of things start to kind of come back on you, or make you take notice of certain repetitions in your life. We're going about it, at least I think, of a certain age, we're all going about it kind of like in a reverse kind of situation here, because when this story came out, it was probably the original version of this story that led into another script, which is one of the more famous scripts in Star Trek, not by Gene Roddenberry, but as a story, and that's Mud's Women, because the very opening scene of this episode, Paladin's reading to Hey Boy a newspaper article about mail order brides for a mining town. And it kind of felt very early draft. Well, it's not an early draft. It's its own story. But to Mud's Women, by comparison, it feels like an early draft of Harry Mudd bringing 3 women to a mining town or a mining planet. Mm-hmm. So here's something that we haven't done before. I think altogether in this format, a little bit of a history lesson. Well, we did for karate, but not for Have Gun Will Travel. Bend in the River, Oregon. Because Paladin kept saying this, especially when he met like the madame who needed to get across, to the, to wherever he was going. Bend in the River, Oregon is in fact the city name of Bend, Oregon, which is located at a 90-degree bend in the Deschutes River. And the origin of the name, the area was originally known as Farewell Bend, after a ranch was established there in the 1870s. This is the same time period that Paladin was supposedly there. The name comes from the river's bend, which pioneers recognized as a formidable crossing point, and it showed, because the rapids there looked very, very violent. In 1886, the post office was granted for the settlement under the name Bend. Bend was incorporated as a city in 1905, etc., etc. So I thought it was really neat that Gene, writing for the 1870s in his script, actually paid attention to the detail of calling that particular area Bend in the River, Oregon. I like stuff like that.
Yeah, a lot of this episode, and I think we flagged this at the time, it felt like we were LARPing the Oregon Trail.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Are you going to try to ford the river, or are you going to try to, keep going up the shore?
I was waiting for dysentery to set in, because that's obviously a wonderful meme of that game.
Mm-hmm.
When Paladin says to the madam, you'd have to load the gun before it's fired, as any good barbarian knows. Gene loves using that word. He loves using barbarian. It's he said that in The Return of Roy Carter, when Roy Carter and Paladin were when actually April and Paladin were sitting around the fire talking about like the violence of being barbarians, and justice. So very interesting. Also, again, a callback to A Taste of Armageddon about being barbarians and not killing today. I wasn't really sure about this episode until I finally got to this quote, which was a nice little turn, finally, for not being like an overtly sexist episode. Because I do like that Paladin says, on the trail, everyone, man or woman, does a full day's work. Because he's saying that we're going to experience like 200 of the hardest miles imaginable in this region. So it also kind of shorthands the whole fact that these women are not just there for looks, even though that there's a mistake that was made along the way. Like these were like 3 French prostitutes. Never did they ever say that this was their occupation, but it's kind of like implied. But I do like that they were at least given a modicum of skills to be able to survive out there in the hardness of this climate. They know how to dig. They know how to forage. I was not a fan of Paladin bringing rabbits back to the camp to skin and eat, but he taught them how to skin and eat and make campfire food to survive in the wilderness. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know. Is this a weird take on this, weird read on this, or did you guys see the same way?
I felt like this was, and I'm pretty sure I said this in our original podcast covering the girls, I liked this better than I liked Mud's Women. To me,
Yeah.
Mud's Women was a lot more troublesome than this script. partly because, here we are seeing, yes, everyone is going to have to direct full effort at this, and, pretty currency is not going to buy you anything on the Oregon Trail. But Mudd's Women has that whole Venus drug angle, right, that makes it much, much more troublesome. And I don't know if Gene was commenting on pimps there or what with Harry. Again, just a reminder, I will die on this hill. Harry Mudd was never a harmless figure of fun. He was always dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And not a good guy, not a harmless character. I think people conflate him with Cyrano Jones, who was, in the lingo of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, mostly harmless.
Mostly harmless.
Harry Mudd was never harmless. But yeah, end of detour from the Oregon Trail there. I just find Mudd's Women a far more troubling take on this story. And maybe Gene was trying to get into more modern stuff than he was allowed to talk about, and I have to allow for that possibility. And, we mentioned that Mudd's Women, for on-screen credits, was not written by Gene. It was almost certainly heavily rewritten by Gene.
Right.
And so we can't completely say that he was out of the loop there.
Right.
In addition to the possibility that he may have suggested the story to a writer to flesh out, okay, we would like to do a mail-order bride story.
And there was a little bit of surprise at the end of this. Not a surprise from the narrative standpoint, but kind of like a tie-in to Mudd's Women, where there are going to be probably just as many women as there are men that are available for reasons, right? For everyone to kind of find their significant other, couple, mate, however you want to phrase it. And that's not the only reference that we've seen in this group of episodes. I'm kind of seeing another pattern here that I will discuss later on in more like morals, meanings, or messages. So we're going to move to, I think was a very, very interesting also and very good episode, The Posse. There was a lot going on in this episode, and there was a lot of historical references to a specific philosopher, Herodotus, who was mentioned several times. But you kind of feel where this episode's going when a stranger that's kind of hanging out from a hanging tree says to Paladin, look, just because two strangers meet, they don't got to be suspicious of each other. Yeah, they kind of do, right? Especially in the Old West, and especially while you're like laying in the weeds with a rifle pointed at you. I'm really surprised that Paladin just hasn't died like a billion times over in this series, right?
Everyone seems to get the jump on him very often. And again, because of how we are covering the works of one writer, it seems to be an opening gambit that Gene uses a lot.
Right.
I can't vouch for how often that is the opening gambit for other episodes of Have Gun Will Travel, but Gene shows Paladin getting rolled for his lunch money a lot.
And I have an observation about that. I'm not sure how you guys feel about it, but is he always caught off guard for someone who's supposed to be a soldier for hire, specifically done because he is the optimist and tries to see the good in every situation before things go badly? Is this the lesson that he's learned from Robert April, even though that he has been jumped prior to the hanging of Roy Carter? Or is this something that maybe this is like why he turned into a soldier of fortune, is because he wants to help people optimistically resolve their situation?
It's a good question.
Or is it just more like, I think we've talked about this before, is it just easier for an all clad in black gunman with obviously a certain set of skills to get taken down a peg or two in order for the heroic turn to be more heroic?
Well, yeah, kind of like the general rule that the way that you most effectively show that someone means business is they get to beat up Worf. Because Worf's a big Klingon. Yeah, if you could beat up Worf, oh man, well, you could obviously have wiped the floor with any of the humans in the room, but no, you beat up Worf.
Yeah. Okay, I know it is, but when I was watching this for the first time, I was like, is that Denver Pyle as the head of the posse? Uncle Jesse?
Yeah.
And then I heard him talk. I'm like, that is Uncle Jesse's voice. And we will see him later on in future works. I'm glad that there was a bit of skepticism about Dobie or Doe-B or Doughboy, because he was kind of like that, just kind of a mushy, Pillsbury, stick your finger in his stomach kind of, weakness to him. There's an interesting study here, and I'm not sure, like, again, how you guys feel about it, talking about it now, but we have made reference of kind of like this dichotomy of justice, law versus mob justice, like actual, like literal, bring someone in court of law and have their rights actually retained during the course of the investigation, or just what Logan did to Tuttle and exact quote unquote mob justice. Paladin says in this episode, a good lynching needs tears and screams and terror. The more excitement, the less thinking. The ideal victim is mentally or emotionally ill. Of course, the professional hangman will get the first chance at him. Lynchers have to be content with people who are merely a little bit different. Little people, the weaker they are, the better. And in anger, our lips shall form the truth. Rarely do we get this quality of writing in Gene scripts. And he's doing like for a very specific philosophical angle for Paladin in this one. He could have easily just objected to, hey, I'm the innocent guy here. You don't want to hang me. I have this, I have that. I can prove it all. But he'd rather force the obligation back on the posse itself. And I'm wondering if Gene is making us, the audience, think in the same way, since we are basically the analog for the posse as the audience.
I think keeping in mind Gene's background as a police officer, you have some people who wear that badge who are very cognizant of innocence until proven guilty. And I would say Gene was probably in that camp. You have others who act more like Denver Pyle's character here. Let's get this over with. Let's get it done. I think Gene is reminding everyone of that obligation of a fair hearing, of the due process. But of course, out here, it's really interesting because episode in Laredo and this episode seem to be cut from kind of the same cloth. It's an episode where there's a lot of talking and it all happens in one place. Episode in Laredo, that all happens in that hotel lobby. The posse, all happens around that tree. First off, that's extraordinarily cost-effective. That's the kind of writing that will get you invited back to do more. But the other thing is, it proves that the setting almost doesn't matter as long as the story and the characters and the ideas that you're putting before the audience are enough that it kind of achieves primacy over whether there is a set or a location or anything like that. So these two episodes, that we've talked about today, they're of a piece. But I definitely feel like Gene was trying to put forth some of his own ideas on, what constitutes justice? What are the steps toward justice?
Right.
Again, do you try to spill the blood of the first person you can get hold of? Or do you actually let due process happen? By the way, you were mentioning the philosopher Herodias, which I went looking for this philosopher and couldn't find a thing. I found a philosopher whose name was very similar, recorded a whole scad of historical information about this person, and then dropped it out of the podcast because I found out after we had recorded that the answer to this is much simpler than you think. The philosopher Erodius, how would you spell that? E-R-O-D, as in Eugene Roddenberry Sr. He was Erodius. He came up with that stuff out of whole cloth. He was not quoting anyone. That came as a surprise to me after all the... I went down the wrong rabbit hole trying to research that and then dropped it out of the show. It's in the VAM, if everyone wants to hear me go make a complete fool of myself. Because the actual philosopher who I found, not everything really lined up with these quotes that Gene was peppering this episode with. And that's because they're not quotes. Gene just made it up.
Well, that makes like this particular one even more significant if it is in fact like his own writing, because this is what Paladin says. In his third essay, Rodius said, "We can contend with the evil that men do in the name of evil, but heaven protect us from what they do in the name of good." And you can see this backtracking to the return of Roy Carter and then backtracking even further in this vein of a particular pattern and style. It's really interesting that he's almost couching, this is Gene, he's almost couching like his philosophy in sort of a religious type of dogma when it's not religious in itself. It's more of kind of like this humanitarian observation of, if you choose to do this, does it legitimize the fact that you're doing good or evil based on the facts or based on the evidence? Because again, Logan was probably doing everyone a favor. But what he did, shooting Tuttle in the back, was a crime. What these guys are doing, they're probably doing, when they eventually get it right, they are probably, bringing somebody to justice who's murdered people in cold blood. They're doing the law and the citizens of their territory a favor, but murder is that actual justice, right? So that's a really interesting thing that we're seeing a lot of in Gene's stories. Just remember what you do here today, you will live with for the rest of your life. Really kind of echoed for me what Maximus said in Gladiator, what we do in life echoes in eternity. And I love that there's a kind of, almost kind of like this weird obfuscation of doing the right thing or doing, I guess, the world a favor with your own reasoning, with your own, with justifying something that is not necessarily lawfully the right thing.
Well, what's that phrase that we hear so often these days? Oh, save the taxpayers some money. Is that necessarily seeing justice done, though?
Right. As a taxpayer, sure, I like it when somebody saves me some money, but I'm not going to do that at the expense of justice.
And finally, we have come to the road to the golden toad, or the long and winding toad, or however you want to call it.
A most riveting episode, my friend.
Or perhaps we're calling it, or at least I called it, Les Girls Part 2. Because, again, it's not that some of these scripts were precursors or like tests of where these scripts ultimately will go. I think it's just Gene evolving certain ideas that he didn't get into all of one script into multiple scripts. Of course, then again, if it is Les Girls Part 2, is it Les Girls or Les Girls?
I
never get that right.
I think it's Les Girls. That's what
I was going for the French pronunciation, which is Les Girls.
Because if it is Les Girls Part 2 or Part 2, then it would also be Mud's Women Part 2 or 3? Oui? I don't know. No. I speak about as much French as those women were speaking in Les Girls.
I minored in Spanish, so...
Norman, you're saying your command of French was not blossoming like a tulip?
Oh, don't. Yeah. All right. Okay. So here's something that was really, really strange at the beginning of the Carlton Hotel. So did you notice that there was like a pool of newspapers, like basically pulling around Paladin's feet? Now, does he just like read his newspapers and just let them just there? Just leave them there for Hey Boy to pick up? Because he literally like walks away to write this card for his new client, but there's just this mess of papers by his feet. Come on, man! It's like, you don't just trash up the place like that. This is your home, right?
Well, and more to the point, obviously he's trolling through all these issues of the paper, or all these various newspapers, basically looking for the next gig. Looking for someone saying, "Oh, hey, I need you to help me with my tiger curse. I need you to help me find my mail order brides. I need you to help me with this monster that is terrorizing this town in Colorado." We've seen him cut this stuff out with like a penknife.
I love that, by the way.
Right.
I need a penknife.
So are these the complimentary papers in the lobby of the Carlton Hotel? And does that mean the next person's going to try to read the story? And it's like, hey, someone cut something out of this paper.
The next soldier for hire is going to get no work because all of the pertinent articles have already been cut out.
Yeah, and what's left on the flip side of that page? Half a coupon. I mean, no consideration whatsoever, I'm telling you. We live in a society, people.
Unbelievable. Here is kind of a little bit of something unbelievable, too. So, Paladin takes the paper over to kind of the stationary area of the hotel, gets his pen and ink, of which I do love. I love crow quills, and I love kind of like the old style of dipping a pen, a nib in ink, and then writing, because it's messy and the ink pools, but it also gives you these wonderful blobby letters. I love that. So I was watching Paladin write down the address for this particular new client that he's going to mail his card to, and he spells Arizona with an S. I watched it literally, this is not hyperbolic, I watched it 10 times. And I wanted to see him, because the pen stroke in the Z goes from left to right to diagonal down, left to right. That's the Z shape. Also very famous in comic book narrative storytelling. Paladin writes, he starts with upper right, then curves down to lower left and finishes off the flourish. Like, that's an S. So I was like, okay, internet, regale me with tales of why this was spelled with an S and not a Z. So I looked at Google, and Google basically said there were Spanish spellings of Arizona with both a single and a double S historically when that territory was being fought over and then eventually ratified as the 48th state of the Union, contiguous Union. If this were in fact 1870-ish, usually like 1872 or 3, this happens after Arizona becomes a state. So why would he write it that way? Unless Richard Boone or whoever it was hand to quill to paper just misspelled it.
Or maybe he has had to deal so many times with the locals. It's like, okay, if you live in the UK long enough, you'll probably learn to start, putting the letter U in words like color and honor.
Couleur.
And so, when in Rome, basically.
So you're saying that the English spelling of velour should just be velour?
I still think we live in a society, although it is rapidly slipping away. It's like the pronunciation fight over GIF or JIF. Every time someone tells me it's JIF, I just say every day we stray further from Jod.
Velour it is. Did you notice that in Less Girls, I'm not even going to pronounce it anymore, different Less Girls, and in this episode, in each group of young women, there are 3 young women, and there were 2 brunettes and 1 blonde in both episodes. Now, I looked at in Mud's Women, and there were 2 blondes to 1 brunette. So
yeah, the opposite. The opposite distribution. I have to point out, Norm, that there were more girls in Less Girls. So I'm still sticking with my pronunciation, buddy.
The bartender's name in this episode is Gene. So I thought that was kind of neat. Not Logan, and certainly not a criminal.
Yeah. Now, something came up in my research after we viewed Les Girls and after we did our podcast that I apparently owe an apology to the entire Roddenberry family for. We got a big laugh out of Willow Dean.
Willow Dean.
Yeah, and complete with Southern pronunciation. We had a good chuckle. It turns out that is the middle name of Gene's sister. So, whoops.
There's so many facts
I think there was like
happening
a connection with every family name.
Every member of that family in this episode had some connection to Gene's family, which, hey, if you're going to give a shout out, you might as well start at home.
I'm glad it was Bend in the Oregon before instead of like Eugene, Oregon. That would have been completely, I think maybe just too on the nose. Okay, so for this episode, you would think if someone reached into their satchel and put down a solid golden toad or frog about the size of a football, wouldn't they freak out just a little bit more and saying, hey, look, there's a giant golden frog on the table there, as opposed to, where'd that come from? Like, does it matter? It's a giant golden frog. It's funny, like how for exposition's sake, just to get past that particular detail. Here's another interesting parallel. A boss man and his 3 daughters versus a boss lady and her 3 male ranch hands.
Yeah, I Ashley, didn't we call this the 7 Brides for 7 Brothers effect?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like Girls had like a little flavor of 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, but this really did.
There was an interesting scene where Paladin and Webster were coming out of the cave, and Webster had the torch in his hand, and he kept trying to slam it into the sand that was right outside the cave, and it fell. and Richard Boone's like, I don't think it needs to be there because it might light me on fire, so I'm going to put it back where it should be. It was just a weird happenstance, and like you can hear like the director's like, keep filming, keep rolling, we're losing daylight. I don't care if someone gets caught on fire, that would just be authentic.
Yeah, I wonder if that was an error that was left on film or if it was a bit of business that they worked out beforehand. It just seems, it does stick out.
He was really trying to like really slam that stake like into the sand. He's like, why isn't the sand budging? What is in this concrete? So yeah, it was pretty crazy. Interesting ending to this. Again, Paladin forcing these 2 camps to become married couples in the end to live long and prosper.
Well, and also to pay for the water rights to the Yavapai Water Company, a.k.a. DBA Paladin. This is a guy who knows how to milk the most out of every gig he gets. There's something for all of us freelancers to learn from him.
He definitely knows which side his bread is buttered on.
That goes back to, okay, this guy is very smart. He walks into a situation where he knows, okay, these are the players. And this is what I need to do in order to, again, get my fee and then also to appear like I'm actually on the job. And he's very coy about it and very smart. And there is kind of like a Maggie O'Banion kind of flavor to this. This is one Paladin that we do love. He sees like kind of like the forest from the trees. And then you get Maggie O'Banion get basically caught with his pants down, riding across, a field by 2 ranch hands or by a guy hanging out underneath a tree, to basically, get the one up on a soldier of fortune who knows how to finagle the water rights of a town 2 counties over from a city and an official to create a stake in a claim. So it's like, yeah, okay, all right. So maybe that's where, when money's concerned, people get a little bit smarter. But I like this episode. It was, again, it seemed like a more refined version of Les Girls than, say, like, the stepping stone in between that and eventually what would become Mud's Women. Because, again, it's, let's see, how many women do you have? How many men do we have? Oh, the same number? And then everyone has lives at the end.
It's a good thing that the girls seem amenable to that. And they kind of flagged that down earlier on. Like, some of the girls have taken a shine to some of the guys. That takes off what could have been a really icky edge to that resolution.
Yeah, definitely a couple of the sisters were all like, oh, well, that guy, whatever his name is, he's not so bad. And his dad's like, if I catch you talking to him, I'll tan your hide. Something like that. It's like, come on, bud.
Yeah,
but,
and these brothers seem much more respectful of these young ladies than, what was the guy from the detective? She's not that bad.
Oh, yeah, that guy. Boo.
All right, well, I believe that engages the croaking device on the golden toad for today. No. Oh, man, tough room.
I like it, Earl. I like it. I'm really going to need to, in the next year, invest in like a good snare and crash cymbal just to have going here in the office.
Oh, don't mistake my head shaking for not approval. I loved it. I just hated it that you got to it first.
Well,
you better hop to it next time, Norman.
Oh, God. Oh. I find that your banter riveting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So that's another run of 5 episodes. This is from seasons 2 and 3 that we were covering here. Once we were past the return of Roy Carter, we were in season 3. Norman, where do you think Paladin is now? Where do you think the show is now? Where do you think Gene is now?
Well, it's really interesting to see kind of like the evolution of Gene scripts, because there were more than a few parallels that I've made to, the original series of Star Trek scripts, even though that Gene, he himself didn't write them. Obviously, he had a very particular hand in crafting kind of like the final production because he was executive producer and showrunner. It's fun watching kind of like the evolution of these scripts as they were happening like in real time, since these were the way that we're reviewing it, the way that you two are reviewing it in particular are in production order. So you're seeing kind of like the evolution of these ideas happen. Now, I guess one question is, are we watching them in production order because that's how they were ordered? Or did he submit a handful of scripts at a time, paid for a quote unquote, 5-6 episode run, and then they'll just release them as they wanted to release them? Because some of them were literally like 4 in a row or 5 in a row. So that to me, it's interesting because you actually get to see Paladin evolve, if you will, throughout the course of some of these 3 to 4 to 5 episode arcs.
Well, keep in mind, way back when we started Have Gun Will Travel, we had that quote from Richard Boone. Sam Rolfe can put whatever he wants on his business card, but when the show is the number 3 show in the land and it's on for 6 seasons, your star is kind of the de facto showrunner. We see that a lot now in the streaming age, where whoever is at the top of the cast list is also an executive producer somewhere in the end credits. That was not something that was said out loud back in this era of television, and yet it was just as true. We had that quote from Richard Boone, who said he would put Gene Roddenberry's scripts up against, I think it was Gene Roddenberry and Harold Jack Bloom were the 2 frequent flyers on Have Gun Will Travel, and that he would put their scripts up against anything by Rod Serling or Patty Chayefsky. Big names in this era of writing for film and television, because he had that much faith that they would deliver. And so perhaps it could be that if Gene handed in a script that was shootable with very minimal adjustment, obviously that's going to get bumped up on the production schedule because it's going to be cheaper to shoot. But I think we also can't rule out basically royal decree by the star of the show. Oh, you've got me a bunch of Roddenberry scripts. Let's go.
And because there are so many of these kind of like grouped together, I think it's easier to see the themes that Gene is writing for Paladin, and particularly these episodes, or maybe all the episodes that have, we've reviewed so far for these supplementals. 2 major themes, though, kind of like rise to the top for me. The first is the immovable object versus the unstoppable force. That's a phrase that a lot of people are very familiar with. It's the paradox that explores the limits of power and resistance. It presents a hypothetical situation where two contradictory entities exist simultaneously, which violates the laws of physics and logic. But more to the point of Gene's scripts, mortal law versus and frontier honor versus frontier justice. Right? So the paradox arises because it assumes that both entities can exist at the same time, which is logically and physically impossible. For example, if an unstoppable force exists, then no object can be immovable. Conversely, if an immovable object exists, then no force can be unstoppable. We saw the power of frontier justice, i.e. taking the law into your own hands, and how that can be a hollow victory. And the code of ethic is applied in taking another man's life and the repercussions therein. We saw this in The Return of Roy Carter and episode in Laredo and Posse, where the decision of frontier justice is one particular part of the equation versus the actual modicum of law and order being the other part of the equation. Paladin kind of being caught in the middle. Can both exist simultaneously? We kind of saw that a little bit in episode in Laredo where, yes, Tuttle was like, you know what? This is not what I want to do. Logan takes the law into his own hands, kills a gunman who is abusive because it's the right thing to do, at least in Logan's estimation, maybe even in Paladin's estimation. But the thing is that it's not in the law's estimation, but they do exist simultaneously, which gives us a lot more gray area to think about. The other theme that I saw was business makes strange bedfellows. And I think this is kind of self-evident when it comes to episodes that were more emulating the writing path that eventually led us to Mud's Women. So this particular phrase or this particular idea means that in the pursuit of business goals, companies or individuals may form alliances or partnerships which seemingly or unlikely or even have opposing entities, essentially meaning that the need for profit can bring together very different people or groups to work together. This phrase is a variation of the proverb, adversity makes strange bedfellows, which means difficult circumstances can force people with different views to cooperate. And we saw this both in Les Girls and The Golden Toad. Again, both precursors to Mud's Women. I don't think that those are really kind of they're not obtuse or they're not obfuscated in terms of their execution. So how do you guys think my assessment of these episodes were so far, these themes? Am I off base or similar to where you guys were at?
On your second point about business making strange bedfellows, I wonder if maybe kind of a zoom out is required there, and it's not so much business or profit, but survival. Because
I think they can be synonymous, I think, especially in this day and age in the Wild West.
Particularly with the Golden Toad, these people are going to run out of water in a very arid desert-like area if they do not reach some sort of compromise or agreement. Now, because it's a Western, this has to be expressed in terms of Paladin kind of making a shotgun marriage out of it. But still, it seems like one of those cases where, if everyone would talk things out, they probably could have reached this conclusion themselves. But since they are so at odds with each other, it takes Paladin riding into town with gun on hip to get everyone to shut up and sit down and talk. Sort of like that Peter Capaldi speech from Doctor Who. You are always going to have to sit down and talk it out at some point. Why not do that before you start shooting?
My thought was it was kind of akin to me like a medieval sort of peace treaty where instead of having a war, you ally your houses through a marriage. And, we're not going to fight each other because we're on the same side now, because our kids are married to each other. So there's that. So, with that, Paladin incentivized in the Golden Toad. He incentivized, married couples get greater shares. Okay, all right, well then, okay. I can see how this could be mutually beneficial, but it felt like it was not a romance, it was a business transaction. There just happened to be some pre-existing romance there.
Yeah, Paladin seems to be very good at spotting when someone has a brand new pair of roller skates and someone else has a brand new key.
Well, we'll come back to that in really quick, because I think it's kind of like it's a little bit more on the obvious side, especially with the posse maybe versus like less girls. At the end of this, though, I do have a few questions that I want to kind of keep open to the both of you, and then even to the audience. You can always send us the emails. We'll talk about that later. The questions I have for you. Number one, first and foremost, and we mentioned this earlier on, who was Robert April to Gene Roddenberry, and why was his name so important to several of Gene's projects? Okay, so going to pretty much the path of least resistance, let's go to Wikipedia. Now, according to Wikipedia, a prison chaplain named Robert April appears in 2 episodes of Have Gun Will Travel, 1957 and 1963, for which Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry wrote, "The name stuck with Roddenberry, and Robert M. April commanded the starship Yorktown in his 1964 Star Trek proposal to CBS. The captain's name was changed to Christopher Pike when NBC accepted the Star Trek project later that year." So, again, the question, was Chaplain April and the virtues that he possessed, the very virtues that made a man like Paladin revere and respect April, the DNA of both Pike and Kirk, since they are direct offshoots of April's character's pitch for Gene's first Star Trek proposal? Is he the DNA for Captain Kirk?
Could be. I also feel obligated to point out that we had a Colonel Pike, a former Confederate Colonel Pike in Juliet. So we've got Pikes and Aprils all over the place in Gene's work, and the name Pike will turn up again in other work prior to Star Trek. So, yeah, I would really like to know who Robert April was. Now, we know that name was not going to stick around too long because his middle name was not Tiberius, as opposed to James Kirk and Lieutenant Rice,
right?
Both of whom were saddled with that middle name. If you align with George Kirk in Star Trek 2009,
the name's the worst.
Yeah, exactly. Document in a way that we could find out later.
I mean, it's very significant, again, because it's been repeated so many times.
Yeah, it's a statistically outsized recurrence of those particular names.
Mm-hmm.
The other theme that I saw, prevalent in these episodes, why was Gene so focused on and interested in couples therapy in a sense? So many of these scripts deal with Paladin being the romantic catalyst that brings 2 different groups of people or individuals or both together to live long and prosper, to survive, as we've said, to come together for a variety of different reasons. Again, survival, economics, relationship building, et cetera, comfort, family. So many of his scripts that we've reviewed either in the previous supplemental or today in this episode, it's basically Paladin forces the issue between men and women to come together. And it's not just in these group situations. You saw it in Helen of Abjanian. You saw it in Ella West. You saw it in The Monster of Moon Ridge. You saw it in Juliet, Maggie O'Banion, and now Les Girls and The Golden Toad. So again, there's they're very different themes, but they almost appear in all of the episodes that Gene has done so far, these 2 specific themes. And I'm wondering where those come from.
I'm going to really stick my neck out there and be daring and question whether or not this had anything to do with where Gene's personal life was at the moment, which is not something we talk about too often on this podcast, but he did go through more than one marriage. And this couples therapy working its way into his scripts, maybe he actually attended couples therapy, or maybe it was some kind of wish fulfillment. You can't really rule that out. So without going into it much deeper than that, because, I don't know anything, I wonder if it was perhaps kind of a mirror being held up consciously or unconsciously to the writer's real life. Norm, buddy, thank you for being with us again. You are always a part of Gene-ology, and we are always happy to have you back. And, in fact, we still have more Have Gun Will Travel to backtrack and cover with you again. Until then, just a reminder, Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on Facebook at missionlogpod. And remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. Patreon is your gateway to all things Mission Log, including exclusive access to the unedited version of our show and our private Discord, where you can interact with us, your hosts, during scheduled live chats, along with occasional screenings. You can access all this for just $1 a month. So head over to www.patreon.com/missionlog to see what tier works for you and join the conversation. By the way, reviews help our shows more than you ever know. If you don't have it in you to write a blurb about why Ashley and I are really cool, and Norm, I think the three of us together is maybe not an explosive combination, but definitely a hilarious one. 5-star reviews go a long way to tell the algorithm, and thus the outside world and fellow future genealogists, that you like us. You really like us. Other people might like us too. So give us that 5-star rating now before we jump into it, or if you're driving, hello Siri, please remind me to drop a 5-star review for Gene-ology when I get home. Thank you. And now Siri wonders who the hell that was. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com, and Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment.
On the next Gene-ology, Wrangler. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.